Porter, Ethan Kimball for offering the welcome today. Betty eclipsed by the ignorant, the self-proclaimed elite, that find it so hard to simply be polite to those who are different from themselves. Today is a new day in which some who ridiculed the different years ago have expressed authentic remorse. Others have presented their deepest apology through a script written by a secretary or lines taken from a book. And others have maintained stony hearts and passed on the tradition of discrimination to their children and grandchildren. And still, the rain falls. But serenity is near. For years, rusted hearts have persevered. Generations have watched society ripen, and soon its maturation will be complete, and the rain will end. Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank CSA for inviting me. Well, I played there 2 times. The first time was in 1972. A benefit for the presidential candidate, George Bush. Shame you didn't win. We all found out what happened. This is a song about listening. It's the hardest thing for us to do. There's a very careful way of listening that's very beneficial. And I think really what we really need to listen to most of all is the earth. All the aspects of the earth. That's what the song's about. It has a lot to teach us if we just listen. Listen to the wind. It carries a song. Listen to a glow. It's gentle. It's strong. Listen with your eyes. It can calm your mind. Drink its sweet wine. Straight from the vine. Listen to the trees. They're calling to you. Listen to the skies sing so blue. Can't you see the rain? Doesn't know its name. Never feels the pain. Doesn't need the sting. It's always coming down, never going up. It never tried. Horses on the run. They're flying so free. They're breathing near. They're just happy to be. They haven't got a care. The wind through their veins. They never feel the need to explain. Shining in the sun, a clear glassy lake. Do what you will, or your heart's gonna break. Someday, listen to the wind. It carries a song. Listen to the glow. It's gentle and strong.
Thank you for your guests. write some things down. I don't know what I get to this in the next 10 minutes or so. First thing I'd like to do is to commend, thank, recognize the organizers of this commemoration. We don't do this often enough, and this really is a part of our general ignorance, not only about history of the 19th century, but in the last 25 or 30 years, the last generation. You can see that I don't know anything about that. So, thank you, whomever, the students here at Augsburg, for having memory of our time. That's what keeps us conscious of ourselves as human beings, is our history, it's our history. And history has been tackled a lot by a lot of people. Only for our history is a collective of lives collectively agreed upon. But not so. You know, you can do things with history. It is in us. It's not something written in a book. It's something that you carry within you. It's not really about the past. It's about the present. In words of Faulkner, the past never really passes. It's always a part of us. And it's sad to see that we don't know much about this most dramatic period in American history. And when I say we, I'm talking about the nation, by we draw blanks. It's sensible and intelligent, I think, to reflect on experiences which shape our lives. All our lives are shaped by well, the past, whatever happened yesterday, affects what happens today. Keep saying that. They'll tell me even the war happened 24 years ago. Still affecting the next 5 seconds. But history is a coming thing. It always is a part of us. What happened here at Augsburg in May of 1968, on the heels of Martin Luther King's assassination, was a part of the general spirit of awareness and movement of ideas which was taking place in this country. That junction led largely by students all over the country. This is the first in American history where the student population had become politicized. Not even European students, not even students in places like Brazil, but for Americans. This is the first where students were involved in off-campus political activities. I argue, and argue this to provoke thought, that American students at one time were the most Latin students of the Western world in terms of politics. They just were apolitical. They did all kinds of exciting things, mudslides, see how many private telephone booth, how many goldfishes you can swallow, and all that good stuff. And cat it out with annual spring panty raising in girls' dormitory. Big teeth. That's what most American students were doing, whatever. Princeton, Yale, Harvard. They were doing that. They weren't political. Until a handful of students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat in 4 freshmen. And that stimulated the whole growth of consciousness among students that we elite schools. The historically black college was started in knowledge. They might not have known what they were doing with 4 freshmen. They were catalysts and creative agents for conscientizing, that's the Mandela word, conscientizing the student population in America. And I think we can salute them. At Augsburg here, I can remember it well. I was a very young guy, about 13. Wow. And they had this marvelous day of closing the school and having a teaching instruction. Sitting a teaching where people, voices you don't normally hear in academia, voices from conscious people who were active, who were engaged, some scholars who were organically engaged with the town and beyond, and other interpreters of the American life beyond the classroom and conventional wisdom of principalities and powers. It happened. It was a great day. It was very powerful to ignore as a political and economic reality, but I think it's utter nonsense. I make that crystal clear. So when I say race, I'm always saying it in quotes. They don't really exist. It's like ghosts. You know, people who believe in the visibility of ghosts see them all the time. Right? It's important to define these times. And I just want to say, see if you can, maybe you're very young, but you heard about some of these things. It was an atmosphere of tremendous creativity, brought largely by young people, their energy, and sometimes aimless energy in this direction. But nevertheless, the energy comes before we can shape it and give it form to it. The students at Augsburg be committed to at least intellectually relating to some of the turmoil that likely was a changing time. That was 1968 was a year in which student activism, I think, was even more widespread than it was in the early 60s. Every college and university in this country criticized was touched by the struggle for social justice for democracy. Almost, there were about 4,000 colleges in this country. Very few were left out of struggle on some of them. Here again, just a little bit. The first three students who were killed in student activism at the South Carolina State University College in Augsburg, South Carolina, trying to desegregate a voting area. They were shot in the back, 14 of them were wounded. Well, that's before Kent State in 1970. If you know it. At another historically black college, Augsburg State University, Augsburg State College, in Mississippi, the backwaters of Mississippi. Probably never heard of a person there in Steve McNair, who was a football fan, who did it, black college, in the middle of nowhere. Those students were tear gassed by the state troopers. 1968 was the year in which the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders in Augsburg, because the government of Illinois at that time, we defined it thusly. It was issued and revealed that white racism was the fundamental cause of the rebellions taking place in the cities. I still believe it. I think white racism, white supremacy is gone anyway. It's a doctrine, it's an ideology, it's at the root of the problem in America. It was theirs in the first article, section 3 of the American Constitution. These 55 men who founded this republic made sure that race mattered. Made sure it was if you cannot read that document and come up with any other conclusion. People being 3/5 of human beings, other people being in effect non-persons, Native Americans, and then the class question of unproperty white classes, people who couldn't even vote, and women were somewhere up there in limbo. They weren't here, they weren't there, they were just whatever. You know, it was somebody's wife or sister or whatever. So it was not democracy. It was a republic, and it still is a Republican form of government, a representative form of government. I'm astounded that most Americans don't know that. Excuse me for sounding, over there. That this is not a democracy, it's a republic. That's what the John Birch Society used to say. Not a democracy, it's a republic, and let us keep it that way. Representative form of government. It's not a direct democracy. Democracy is struggle. It's a process. It's not a done deal. It's not a done deal. It's easy to lose and more difficult to win. And its essence is eternal struggle. If you're not struggling, you're not doing democracy. Democracy is something you do, in the words of Thurgood Marshall. Not something you just think about. You have to make democracy. You have to create democracy. And to the extent that democracy exists, people have created the voluntary sector that is together. Whether you talk about the abolitionist movement, the women's rights movement, the working class movement, the pension movement, the student movement, and go on and on. That's what creates democracy. Not in the the most radical act by any leader when he called all of the disaffected, marginalized, oppressed Americans based on economics. And that meant, yes, black people, yes, Native Americans, yes, Mexicans, when he expanded it, Mexicans. That's an interesting term, I just switched, but we were Mexican back then. And then, last but not least, critical, with the unpopular class, descendants of poor white people in Appalachia, in the Ozarks, Piedmont. You know what I'm talking about? Dollar Parks group. That's what I'm talking about. People that embarrassed this country. The whites who were victimized by slavery. And he called all of those people together. Nobody said multiculturalism. See? Nobody said it just existed. That's already a fact. Multiculturalism. We talk about it now, but we did it in the 60s. People were in fact together for a time. For 6 years, you had a multicultural movement in this country led by black people. It exists. Now we got athletes like my students, I also do a high school thing with students every day because it was my duty to do that. They got all the form. They got the dress, the words, the hairdos, everything. But none of the politics. They're empty-handed. They got all the right militant words. They speak the words of the people in the 60s, but there's no action, no relationship to their lives. They're just doing the hair thing. You have to remind them that to grow your hair out in the 1960s was a political act. You know, that man with black hair grow. That was an act of politics. Good style and profile. Trying to look good. When a male was raised in this society, this super chauvinistic male society, that's feminism. Female. Women braid their hair. People did that. That was an act. And you look at an example, I did it all. With the hair, the braids, the bush, the beard, whatever. Yeah. You couldn't talk any other way. You make a political statement. Those are politically, now it's form, it's fashion. Martin Luther King was in between two movements. The Memphis movement, the garbage man strike, which simply said, it's great, the greatest slogan of the 1960s, I am a man. 200 men at the same time. That's what it's about, President. I am a man, a human being, a person, put on this earth by God. I don't want to hear anything about class and race and all of that. I'm a human being. That's the greatest slogan of the 60s, to me. The writing 50 different signs, that what it's reduced to. Yes, I'm poor, yes, I'm white, but I'm a human being, just like you. I have a beating heart. You know, I got it, but you got it. And probably will lead pretty much the same, you know, more palpitation of the heart. Great. And he was enchanted between two movements. And 100 people set up tents in Resurrection City, as they call it. We will stay here until the government deals with jobs. Deals with jobs and freedom, with the economic question. That was squashed. People in North Minneapolis were very involved in the political campaign. Sent bus loads of material. Just one more minute. I'm skipping over all the good news. I want to say that every act in the 60s, in that year, did something to raise people's level of understanding. What the students did on campus, taking over administration buildings and so forth, what the students did at the Democratic National Convention, chaotic though it was very educational. People to finally understand what was going on. In Chicago 8, with Ruth and Bobby Seale, the Black Panther Party, who did it the only way you could do it. How do you get authority? You take it. And I'm not going to let you take it over my life. And so he would respect the judge. Called Judge Hart and everything that the child got. And they gagged him. You're not a race, that's ridiculous. That's stupid. Because people who look like black people are race. If the race is supposed to suggest something pure, that's the most stupid thing in the world. They are a nationality with a given set of experiences, a shared vision, shared visceral values, beliefs that are not shared with anybody else. That's just like saying you're Irish. That's not a color, that's a shillelagh. Right? That's a shamrock. Right? You understand what I'm saying? It's other things that make people who they are. It's not your color or your race. It's essentially your culture and your history that gives you your who-ness, your reality as a human being, a specific time-space group of people. So, the politics change, the way people behave on college campuses changed. They made an adjustment to it and hasn't changed since. Kind of frozen, crystallized. But let me say something on behalf of that. I wrote this a long time ago, just about it. One of the great anomalies, I think the greatest contradiction between ideal and reality is the struggle of African Americans for democratic rights in democracy. Put simply, the overriding reality of African American history is the struggle for democracy, for rights so eloquent that enunciated the Declaration of Independence, so simply articulated in the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and 1875, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, 65, and 68. The question is, if America could be a society of laws and policies of one standard, if America not indeed a people with the highest respect for law, then why is the question of human civil rights for African people, that is to say, the citizens of enslaved African populations, remains such a persistently vexing question? We must all ask ourselves as earnest black, white, and all others in between. Why is it so difficult, such a terrifying proposition that democracies will also work for black people? In spite of that, we made progress. Progress is relevant, not fundamental. I'm a fundamentalist. I want to be radical. And to be radical is not to be mean or ugly or tear people or hate people. To be radical is to get fundamental. What is the deal? As business people say, what is the bottom line? That's what we should be. All people who want social change right now, with all that experience behind it, should be radical, not radical Republican or Democrat, but radically committed to the ideals of democracy, to justice, to freedom, to the Judeo-Christian ethic. So you look at that radical. I'm not a Democrat or Republican, I couldn't possibly do that. Or a socialist or a communist or whatever. It's radical. I want to deal with the fundamental question of social justice for everybody. The late, now stop this, Nellis Johnson, who was born not in the ghetto, but in a farm in Minnesota, who became a very important figure in our global history here. Who knows the name? What his name is? The black woman who died at 93 years old, who helped form the DFL party, who was the first black elected official in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, as she said, who was a champion of two movements, women's rights and the labor movement, and three movements, women's rights, the labor movement, and black people's struggle. So that's clear about what I'm fighting for. She was an advisor to Human Humphrey and a lot of other guys who was so advanced in civil rights thinking that Nellis Johnson was advising them. We named a school for her in Minneapolis 6 months before she died. She was born in Lakeville, Minnesota, and moved to Minneapolis when she was about 15. And when she had this job as an elevator operator in one of the hotels downtown, she was making $15 a week. And the man, one of the bosses, wanted to give her a pay cut of $12.50.
But I was visiting a good friend. Well, I hoped to visit him. I found out he was in Vietnam. His wife was there. This was in Watts. Some of you might know that in 1965, there was a conflagration of incredible proportion in the Watts area in southern Los Angeles. So I was there in April 1968 visiting my friends. I was deep in the heart of Watts. My wife was with me, my children. And we were sitting at the table. All of a sudden, there was a knock on the door. And a woman came and handed my friend a note. And my friend read the note and got her head down. And her friend left. And my friend looked up and said, I think you better get in your car. What did she said? I think you better leave right now. And I said, why is that? She said, Martin Luther King has just been shot. So now my friend got in the car, quiet for a while. Yeah. I'll never forget that. Martin Luther King talked a lot about freedom. And I thought a lot about freedom. I spent tons of time reading about it, studying about it, thinking about it. I ran across a remarkable book called Ladies A Pride, written by Victor Hugo back in the 1860s. It was all about a man named Thorne who ended up serving a 20-year prison sentence for stealing a loaf of bread. And it was about his search for freedom. It was one of the most remarkable books I've ever read. After I finished reading the book, I put the words down in the English. I ended up calling Victor's son for several readings. And these words just came to me. I really feel like I wrote these words alone, that they're just given to me. And I was thankful for the given. My name is free, wild and reckless. I can't be stopped. I'm like the wind. I know no boundaries. I can't be chained up. You can't see me. I live with you. I have a sister. Her name is Courage. She's strong as granite, with nerves of steel. She likes bright colors. She's bold as scarlet. She will not flinch. She will not yield. We have a father. His name is Justice. We have a mother. Her name is Truth. When we're together, we take down tyrants. We take on demons, the biggest brutes. Oh, we helped Gandhi to free his people. Nelson Mandela, we did the same. In Eastern Europe, we helped Alexa. The Iron Curtain came down like rain. We love the spirit. We loathe the darkness. We bring the light for all to see. And if you need us, we can be silent. Oh, listen close to what I say. Give up your pride now, we'll come running. Give up your greed and we will fly. Let go of envy, you will find us. Let go of fear now, we're at your side. I'm wild and reckless. I can't be stopped. I'm like wind.
Boy, it's really hard to follow something like that. That was a really incredible story and song. I would like to say that I was getting up here to introduce a really good friend of mine, but I'm not yet. But Pastor Erlandson is somebody that I have a tremendous respect for, and primarily this is because he has a really good understanding of what it means to have the reality of practical power, as Mom so articulated. I met Jim Erlandson through the Urban Strategy, which is a collective of 13 urban Lutheran congregations in St. Paul that are interested in urban renewal in the church, and among these things, race and reconciliation in the church. Jim is a graduate of Augsburg College from the class of 1976. He was ordained in 1987, and he has been the pastor at the Lutheran Church of the Redeemer in St. Paul since 1994. Redeemer is a multiracial congregation in the old Rondo neighborhood of St. Paul, which has been going through a lot of urban renewal itself. And as one in the church who has been working to dismantle discrimination of all kinds, Jim, just a year ago, offered his church as the place for the ordination of Anita Hill, the first lesbian Lutheran minister ordained who is open and in a relationship in the church. So Jim is quite an incredible man, and just wish him well. Thank you.
Well, Chris, we have a few minutes. You need to get going now. Okay. It's good to be here. Thank you very much, sir. I want to set this in the context of a verse of scripture, which is from the book of Micah. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? I'm a child of the 60s. That means my formative years were spent watching Captain Kangaroo and Leslie Casey on television. My teenage musical tastes were formed by the Beatles, Motown, and 60s rock and roll, which probably categorized me as a dinosaur. My politics were formed by listening to songs by Bob Dylan, hearing the sermons and speeches of Martin Luther King Jr., by Vietnam War protests, and by the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Dr. King, and Robert Kennedy in 1968. In high school, we grew our hair out long as a political statement. And we celebrated the first birthday on a hot day in April in 1972, listening to speeches by Hubert Humphrey, an environmentalist calling on us to save the earth. I was not a participant, but I was an admirer of the Woodstock generation, the peace movement, and political activism on college campuses. People my age actually thought that we could change the world, just like John Lennon said in his song, Revolution. When I enrolled at Augsburg College in 1972, this campus was a much different place than it is today. We worshipped in Melby Hall, we studied music in an old church, and relaxed at Cullah's Cabin. We held a rally for George McGovern in 1972, who received my first presidential vote, so I remember that day. Real-life hippies lived in Cedar Riverside. Some still do, I hear tell. And we went to listen to folk music at the Whole Coffee House and Riverside Cafe. In the spring of 1972, there were protests on the University of Minnesota campus against the U.S. bombing and secret invasion of Cambodia, and some Augsburg students actually crossed the Washington Avenue Bridge to join in. Political activism was expected of college students in those days, and sports were passé, at least in colleges where national championships were not the norm. In my sophomore year, Watergate was in full swing, and we had a lot of fun in Professor Miles Stenchel's political science class, presidents, courts, and Congress. During the Watergate hearings, the Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky scandal were nothing in comparison. make a difference if we work for peace and cross borders to seek reconciliation and understanding with others and get to know them. And we who are Christians truly believe that through faith we could be God's agents of change in this world and that we could do it through the church. I still believe that. Seems hard to believe, doesn't it, when on the face of it, the church often seems an obstacle to change in principle, and few people have the stomach or the faith to work for peace and justice anymore. As of September 11th, changed everything. When we look at what is happening in the world around us, it's easy to get discouraged. People seem to be more interested in protecting themselves and their possessions than thinking about transformation. It's hard to think about understanding a neighbor when our government is fighting terrorists and sending out monthly warnings about unsubstantiated terrorist threats. The prospects for peace and understanding look dimmer by the day when we observe what is happening in Israel, where Israelis and Palestinians have been at war ever since I can remember. The church seems distracted by its all-consuming reactions to sexual abuse in parishes, ecumenical agreements and disagreements, and the issue of ordaining gay and lesbian clergy. The media says that young people are more interested in making money than doing right, and are watching Survivor, The Bachelor, and surfing the net instead of reading books, thinking great thoughts, and getting to know one another, which is what college is supposed to be all about. Actually, I don't think all that much has changed from my generation of college students to yours. I mean, the appeal of sex, drugs, and alcohol were just as prevalent in the 1970s as they are now, and the majority of Augsburg students didn't attend daily chapel then either. Is there still being a chapel? Yeah. Thank you very much. Want to check in on that. But I know that there's much more to college life than that. So we should always be suspect about media generalizations about any generation or people. I know that many college students do care about their world. You're thinking about what faith means amidst all that is going on around us and what has real lasting value. Many of you want to know what faith has to do with daily life and the search for truth. And you want to know, like I did when I was in college, whether faith and the church are relevant to the lives we're living and the difficult issues that we are facing today. I've come to say to you today that yes, She had been separated from her parents in a Khmer Rouge work camp in 1975 when she was a teenager, while I was studying here in college, not even knowing she existed. In 1979, she and her family escaped across the border to Thailand, where they lived in a refugee camp, and she and her sisters were baptized. They arrived in St. Paul in 1980. I met them through my work at Christ Lutheran Church on Capitol Hill a few years later. From Kim and other refugees, I learned of their suffering from starvation in Cambodia and what they had to do or eat to survive. It's just like that in many places in the world. Learning their story helps me understand how people are living in Afghanistan, Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Palestine. I'm telling you this because getting to know people who have had a different life experience than me has made all the difference in the world. It has transformed me and will continue to transform me until the day I die. And the one reason that I went to seminary and ultimately became a pastor in the church was my understanding of God's call to me and to all who follow Christ to learn to love our neighbors and to be the hands and feet of God's compassion and mercy in the world. I came to see the church for all of its faults, its shortcomings, its hypocrisies, and its slowness to change as one institution that holds compassion and care for one's neighbor in the highest regard. It is the church that holds mercy and justice to be its highest calling. The church, the ideal church, and it holds it as its model, one who gave his life for others. And it is Christians who have always taken the lead in our country in speaking out against injustice through the movement to abolish slavery before the Civil War, through the Civil Rights era in the 1950s and 60s, and the resettlement of refugees in the 1980s. This calling to do justice, to love mercy, and walk humbly with God is totally countercultural today, just as it has always been, and that is the Christian faith's great attraction to me. The church has traditionally been a community through which Christians can live out their faith in service to others, whether it's by sharing food with hungry people or collecting donations for those who suffer from disasters around the world. In local churches, Christians have meals served through loaves and fishes programs or the Dorothy Day Center for homeless people in St. Paul. Many people bring Meals on Wheels to homebound senior citizens, tutor children in their schoolwork, or gather donations of food and clothing for local food shelves. These are common ministries, which will always be important ways for people to live out their faith in answering God's call to service. We sponsor refugees, build habitat homes, and respond to international disasters. But there is another level of God's call that is often ignored in the church, and that is God's call for justice. It was clear in the Old Testament prophets that God calls people of faith to ensure that widows, orphans, strangers, and the poor are not abused and all have enough to eat and a place to sleep. But we know that all people bishops, our church executives, college professors, and presidents proclaim that message loud and clear. And we who are leaders need to make it possible for all people of faith to participate in the work of seeking truth, doing justice, and loving our neighbors, even our enemies who we don't understand. This is even more critical today, following the events of September 11th, during the current war against terrorism, while we witness the terrible violence that happens every day in Israel and Palestine. I have found myself and my congregation increasingly involved in issues that once I never dreamed would be important to me, to answer God's call for justice. We've worked ecumenically and with people of other faiths to address gun violence in our community, to oppose racism and hate whenever they occur, to support immigrant families with unjust immigrant laws, turn law-abiding people into illegal immigrants who face deportation, and even challenge our own Lutheran Church regarding its policies against ordaining gay and lesbian clergy. So this past year, my church hosted the ordination of Nita Hill, who was a speaker in this afternoon's panel discussion. And we held a prayer vigil this year for the release of Galagos Jimenez, a church worker from Peru who was jailed on an expired visa and threatened with deportation. After September 11th, we joined with other Lutheran and Roman Catholic congregations in holding an interfaith prayer service with our Jewish and Muslim brothers and sisters at the St. Paul Cathedral. This work of doing justice and challenging leaders in our government and in the church is just as much a part of my calling as preaching, teaching confirmation, and visiting the sick. I'm almost done. That doesn't make the work any easier, especially since many don't share or have that expectation of the church or its pastors, and many Christians don't always agree about these issues. Many people have their impressions of pastors in the Lutheran Church from Garrison Keillor and the Prayer Home Companion, or from the movies or TV, which means that most think perhaps that Christian people of faith are either fundamentalist bigots or irrelevant comic relief like Father McCabe MASH. But the truth of the matter is that people of faith are essential to the work of justice and compassion in our world today, and their interests are not limited to prayer or potluck suppers. If the world is going to be transformed by God from a world of violence and hatred for those who are different, people of faith are going to have to take the lead, and first by being transformed ourselves into a new way of living and thinking. And we who are Christians will have to join hands in this work with people of faith who are Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists from all over the world. So I thank you for allowing me to speak today, for staying, and so that I can share with you what I view as having ultimate importance. The calling by God for the church and its people to leave our sanctuaries and go out into the world to seek truth, do justice, and love our neighbors. I hope that you will join and consider joining me in this exciting journey of transformation. Thank you.
Well, there were a lot of important things that you said today. I'm glad I was here to hear it. I've been kind of struggling here for the last 5 minutes or so, trying to figure out what songs, many songs to sing. I don't know any song that would be better right now than this one. The song was written by Bob Dylan back in the early 60s. But it wasn't for Bob Dylan, I probably wouldn't be standing here right now either. How many times must the cannonballs fly before they are forever banned? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. Come people exist before they're allowed to be free. How many times must a man pretend he just doesn't see? Oh, the answer, my friends, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. How many times must a man look before he can see the sky? How many years must one man before he can hear people cry? How many deaths will it take till he knows that too many people have died? Well, the answer, my friends, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. Blowing in the wind.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, and please feel free to join us for the rest of the day. We have the headlines.
This is the first of our panel discussions this afternoon as part of our One Day in May Revisited. And the first panel discussion today is focused on racism in day-to-day life, defined, identified, and recognized. And we're very happy to welcome 4 distinguished panelists to participate in our discussion this afternoon. And Joe Young, one of the panelists, is the director of the Pan-African Student Center here at Augsburg College and serves as a student advisor. And Mahmoud El-Kati is a professor at Macalester College in St. Paul and is a professor of history and African American studies, and spoke at our convocation this morning as he was part of the original One Day in May in 1968. And the Honorable Judge Pamela Alexander is Assistant Chief Judge of the Hennepin County District Court and has served is a alum of Augsburg College, has served in the past on the Board of Regents and as commencement speaker. And Erica Thorne is a white feminist who has devoted working for racial justice. Her passion for 17 years has been working with other white people to take responsibility for our racism and building coalitions. She will be co-facilitating the groundbreaking workshop Plantation Shuffle, which she co-created with the late Rebecca Rice at this June's Allies for Justice Conference, sponsored by the Headwaters Fund in St. Paul. And Erica is a partner in Future Now, a worker-owned business providing consulting and training to groups working for justice. And brochures for Allies for Justice and Future Now will be made
over at that round table with the blue tablecloth.
available. Yep.
Thank you, Jim.
All right, and I will leave it up to the panelists to make it through the day's discussion. I'm really excited to hear what they have to say.
Well, thank you for coming. We want to invite anyone out in the hallway to come on in. If you feel like coming on in, please be invited. As I start for a couple of minutes, I'm going to share a couple of quick thoughts. I actually have to dash out of here to go pick up our keynote for this evening. But I want to start some trouble, because oftentimes we dance around the issue of racism, particularly because we live in a politically correct climate and aren't really honest about what we're talking about, because oftentimes we take the word race and racism and have interwoven it with so many other things, watered it down, diluted, that even addressing it doesn't change any of the conditions that all of us complain about. So when we're talking about racism, what we're talking about is a system that can be properly defined as white supremacy, which is not based upon an individual, but based upon an ideal. And that ideal empowers all white, quote-unquote, European descent folk to have a system of power and authority that subjugates all other non-white people. And so when you're talking about race and racism, the actuality of what you're dealing with is not an individual. It's not even a group of people, but it is a built-in structural system of practices and based on values that subordinate people one from another. And when you're addressing it, you have to address it as an ideal and not as an outcome, because we often address the outcome, and the only effect we can do is placing a bandage on scenarios that happen because of human conflict. But when we're talking about an ideal, we then need to come up against that ideal with a different ideal. And that to me becomes the crux of being able to address the issue of racism. Now, you also have to understand that racism is based upon a false notion called race. And this false notion has subjugated humanity into subspecies groups to the extent that we can define who people are, how they'll believe, what they'll act like, and how they'll respond to things based upon how they look. And all you have to do is recognize the works of Darwin and Carl von Linnaeus and recognize how they have contributed scientifically to the proportion of what this thing called race is all about. But on the flip side of that, most modern scientists, biologists, anthropologists, have all recognized, both individually and as conventions, that this notion of race is such a false notion. It makes no sense that we continue to rely upon it to define who human beings are. And I find that to be intriguing in the context of academia, where we still use race to define who people are. It becomes almost a conflict where academia has defined race as a null and void concept, but still perpetuates it within the context of its systems and institutions. And so that becomes part of the challenge that I think we begin to have to address. And let me say one more thing. I've done a lot of recent work and reviewings of the teachings and even the foundations of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he put some things forward, in fact, that I believe ultimately got him killed. And that is, he began to assert, once he moved beyond the issue of race in terms of addressing some of the ills in our society, he began to tamper with the very fabric and foundations of our system. He said Americans should be divinely dissatisfied with what America is. And he cited 4 ills. And these 4 ills were interconnected. And they're very much alive and well today. The first issue was the issue of racism. That is the issue of dealing with people based upon the complexion and color of their skin. And if you're looking at it, even as I do, from the aspect of white supremacy, then you have to include sexism in that whole bulk of things. Then he began to recognize, as he was addressing the issue of race and racism, that poverty became an important aspect. As he continued to dig into poverty, he recognized militarism was an important aspect, and ultimately materialism was fundamentally the flaw that exists in the United States society. And so he began to recognize that we need to be divinely, as he put it, dissatisfied, and this is what he wrote in the Testament of Hope, with racism, poverty, materialism, or militarism and materialism, and recognizing how interconnected these things are. Because once you start peeling the issues of racism away, you're going to find poverty. Once you start peeling the issues of poverty away, you're going to start finding militarism, and then fundamentally, you're going to start peeling away till you get to materialism. And these things are what he recognized as the fabric of things that we've become so complacent with that we don't even recognize how victimized we all are by them. And subsequently to that, he put together something that the Bishop Desmond Tutu tried to use in South Africa to address those issues. And the whole aspect of what he called what Desmond Tutu called divine reconciliation happens not because we want, as human beings, to put the effort in, but we need to recognize a God force, the God power, the God kind of thought about what we're doing as human beings. And that is, the issue that we're trying to deal with is reconciliation, and the first step in divine reconciliation is repentance. And that means you have to admit with a certain type of contrition that something is wrong, something that's never happened from the context of our society as a whole, specifically from the context of our government as it relates to the issue of race. It's never been admitted that something was wrong. In fact, even up until last September, when the World Congress on Racism got together, the United States pulled out of that because they did not want to admit that slavery was wrong and slavery was a crime in the eyes of humanity. That's the reason that this government pulled out of that Congress, because had they admit that, then the fear of all kinds of subsequent subpoenas and court battles with the issues, particularly of those who are descendants of slaves, would arise. But I submit that until you repent, there will be no reconciliation. Until you repent, you can't even talk about reparation. Even though reparation is an issue that's being addressed and needs to be addressed, the first aspect of reparations is admitting that something was wrong. And until that happens, the issue of race and racism will continue to plague our society and humanity, as it always has, in fact, even in more covert and subversive ways that we don't even have a tendency to recognize on a day-to-day basis. So with that, I've said my few little pieces of stuff, and I'll turn it over to our next panelist.
And I'm supposed to follow that, I guess. First of all, I want to thank you for having this discussion on race. A lot of times I have agreed to come out to these because I think that in order to deal with the issue of race, we have to have a discussion. And I think in the last several years, we've moved away from even having discussions about race, and that we tend to want to kind of stick our head in the ground. After September 11th, it was very interesting in that people were kind of coming together saying, oh, gee, we're all Americans, we're all this and all that. And then we had another layer of reacting to race. And I know a lot of you, if you went to the airport since then, and everybody's kind of getting pulled out of line and being looked at, and look at the people who are still being looked at. They're still, the majority of them are people of color. They may look a little different, and I want to tell you, a large number of African Americans are also being pulled aside and looked at, and kind of in subterfuge, are being looked at for other reasons. And quite frankly, you know, I get searched every time, even before September 11th, so it really wasn't a huge surprise to me, even though I don't think I meet the Joy Courier profile, because I think I'm too old now. I finally have enough gray hair that perhaps they won't stop me, but that hasn't happened yet. And recently, on my most recent trip with my 13-year-old, they kind of let me go by, but they stopped and searched her, which I thought was a little bit much. But in any event, race is one of those things that we have to continue to discuss, we have to continue to talk about, and we have to continue to try to recognize in order to come to some sort of resolution. And this is something that I've been talking about since I was a student here at Augsburg College many years ago. And I wasn't here in 1968, but I came soon thereafter, very quickly thereafter, as a matter of fact. And there were still vestiges of all of that discussion at the time. And Augsburg, I think, came through kind of a metamorphosis at that time, because then it became very fashionable to have African American students on your campus. So we got like a whole lot of them when I came in. And the campus really wasn't ready to adjust to us when we got here, which was the first time then they got a black student coordinator, which now y'all call director of the African Center. But the first one came when I was a student here, and I think that a lot of it was adjustments to us being on campus. And I remember my first month here at Augsburg, the Dean of Women at the time, yep, they had a Dean of Women, and she invited us all over to her house, and she told us she was going to sit down and have a discussion with us as to how we should conduct ourselves while we were here, students at Augsburg. And you know, we all sat down, and there were a number of African American women students at the time. I'd say there were probably 25 of us. There was a recruitment of our class was about 50, I think. We had quite a number who came in at the time. And she was going to teach us how to, you know, eat at the table and what fork to use and etiquette and those kinds of things. And, I kind of explained to her, I learned that when I was about, 5. And we went over it in Girl Scouts too, and I kind of knew. And so I didn't really want to stay for the discussion. And Mahmoud will never believe this, but I was a teeny bit militant at the time. Just a teeny bit. I've gotten better as I've gotten older, a teeny bit. And I kind of went, this is the most insulting thing I've ever seen. What made you think that we couldn't eat before we got here? And so I said, no, we're all leaving. So I made everybody get up and leave. And so then they kind of went, she's going to be a problem. And so I did organize a number of protests of different things while we were here at Augsburg for a number of different reasons. We did have a situation that arose here as well where there was a person who had been raping folks in the neighborhood while I was a student here. And what happened during that time is that the police kind of came over, invited by the college, and really just stopped every black person they saw, whether it was male, female, or whatever, and basically we were held on the ground at gunpoint. Well, we were a little concerned. We were students, and we were trying to go to class, and there were issues. So we said, we really would like not to be held at gunpoint, going, to class back and forth. And so would you all do something about that? And the dean didn't really want to hear it, so we had a protest and took over his office and did some other things that you all should never really do now. Peaceful protest is something, and I'm sure your dean is much more open to hearing your ideas than they were in those days. So there was a lot of adjustment to having the number of students that we had at the time. And I'm telling you this because Augsburg was it was a real learning experience for me. I grew up in South Minneapolis, but I went to Minneapolis Central, and I kind of grew up in a neighborhood that, I knew everybody and everybody knew us. And I really didn't face a whole lot of real in-your-face kind of racism, really until I got to Augsburg. And ran into people who had never dealt or been around people of color previously, or seen people of color previously, and I didn't think those people existed. So when I got here, and I had just turned 17, I was an early admit, and I couldn't believe that there were people who had really never even talked to black folks before. I didn't believe those people existed, really. And so it was not only that, it was an eye-opening experience for me. And I was also very open to learn about, lutefisk and Swedish meatballs and all that. I was very open to the whole experience, quite frankly. And I was real open to learning as much as I could about cultures that were different than my own, but I did not see kind of that reciprocation. And we worked real hard as students while we were here to, one, let our presence be known, and to let people kind of know about us, learn about us, and learn about things that were unique to African Americans. And I think that it really was helpful. We did form a very strong Black Student Union while we were here. We did a lot of very positive things on campus, some things that you may never even hear about that we did. But I think that it really was boded well for the school of really kind of adjusting to us and then being more open to hearing some of the ideas that we had, even though we had to push it already. And I think that Augsburg has become more open in how they see things than they have been in the past. But I'm going to talk a little bit about my daily life and what I see in the court system here and some of the things that I've seen in Minneapolis and I think that are happening nationwide. I'm very concerned about the whole issue of race. I'll give you some of my personal experiences, and then I'm going to give you some of the things that I see in terms of racial profiling, in terms of the kinds of folks that I see coming into court all the time, and the kinds of things that are so institutionally ingrained in our system that it's very, very difficult to kind of move to the next level. And I've been fighting racism within the criminal justice system for many years. So this has been a 25, 30-year fight for me to deal with those particular issues. If you went and sat in any court in Hennepin County, whether that was in downtown Minneapolis, in Brookdale, Southdale, or Ridgedale, you're going to find that 40 to 80% of the people who come through are people of color, regardless of where you may be sitting. We have a full-time Spanish interpreter actually 3 that work the Southdale Courthouse every day, and those are the western suburbs. So to give you an idea of who's coming into court. And the kinds of things that I see are not necessarily, because you say, okay, well, they just commit more crimes. Well, you know, that's really not true. And I find that a lot of people are stopped, and I call them crimes of convenience, especially a lot of my Hispanic brothers who come in. They're stopped merely because they're Hispanic to see if they're legal, to see if they have driver's licenses. And so the kinds of charges we get are not the driving conduct that got them stopped, but driving without a license, driving after suspension, driving because you're in Richfield and we want to stop you. And that's primarily what we're getting. And so we're starting to throw a number of those cases out because we think they're pretext stops, that they're not really being stopped because they're doing anything wrong. You know, in America, you're supposed to do something wrong first before somebody can do something to you. That's what I thought. Then I got a couple cases where it showed me that it really wasn't the pretext at all. I had the opportunity also to sit on a case and issue a very strong opinion about a group of young men. These happened to be Asian young men who were standing in a parking lot. And they were all stopped, searched, and arrested because they were standing in the parking lot. And the police officer felt so okay with it, he wrote, well, I just stopped them because they were in the parking lot. And I figured they were too young to be there. We also got a youth thing going on too. You know, so generally, if you're over 50 and white and male, you can probably walk around pretty free. But when you're between 15 and 25, you might have some issues. Because, police don't like y'all's group either. And, well, because, we think we don't like you. And so, that's the crime group. That's the crime age. Then, because, all the studies show you crime out after a certain age. Yeah, because, you just don't want to crime anymore. So you kind of go outside of that. You're like, they're sick of the police, so I'm not going to commit any more crimes after this particular age. So we figure after 35, you're usually, even if you were like a real entrenched criminal, you tend to not do that after you turn 35. So between 15 and 25, we got a youth thing going, and then you have all these folks of color who are coming in, and I'm telling you, it's becoming increasingly problematic when we see the types of things that people are coming into court on. Now, don't get me wrong, there's some people who are criminals and need to be locked up, and I'm doing my fair share of making sure that they're off the street protecting you all. That's part of my job, and I do that well, and I do recognize that there's some people who need to be in jail. So don't get me wrong with these kinds of comments. But we also have a whole segment of people who are coming in for no particular reason. And we had a practice in my county not too long ago where folks were just arrested, kept in jail for 2 or 3 days, and then just let go. Never charged, never anything. And you kept saying, well, what'd you have them here for? So people kept complaining like, hello, we're getting arrested. Would y'all do something? No one's charging us with anything. So what we did then was we had to institute jail detention reviews by an independent party, generally judges, who go in now 7 days a week, 24/7. We go in and review to make sure that the right people are in jail, so that we're not keeping people that shouldn't be there. Now, to me, we shouldn't have to do that, but we have to do that to have a check and balance to make sure that the right people are always there. Now, I'm going to give you some of my own personal experiences. Because you all look up here and go, look, she's a very successful judge. She's got on a nice, gray suit, a nice conservative turtleneck, pretty jewelry, all of that. Well, let me tell you, I have lawyers. I've been a judge now for 19 years. I have lawyers who have appeared in my courtroom many, many times that if I see them on the street will not speak or acknowledge who I am. Will not speak to me. Will turn their head and walk the other way if they see me in any other kind of context than sitting in my courtroom. I have lawyers who have come in and told me that they were uncomfortable because my staff happens to be of color, various ones, various shades. I have some white people too, but they don't like that. And they've told me that they're uncomfortable coming into my courtroom. And, and I said, and you're telling me that for what reason? They said, well, we just want you to know how uncomfortable we are. So I told them, adjust. because there's just, you're just going to have to adjust. There are people of color in the world that have jobs, responsible ones, and you're going to have to adjust to that. There are days when there was a time when my husband and I, we were going to the grocery store, we drove in, stopped in the parking lot. There was an elderly couple next to us, saw us, would not get out of their car, immediately locked the door, and would not come anywhere near us. We went to also, there was a notice that was sent out not too long ago about a level 3 sex offender moving into the neighborhood, so we went to the meeting, just like everybody else, our neighborhood too, so we thought we'd go to the meeting. And about 40% of the people thought my husband was a sex offender, merely because we walked into the building. Now, and I'm going to tell you, he's a very nice-looking older gentleman with nice gray hair. He came in a suit, looked very nice, I thought. And so it just went to show me, I don't care how you look, what you do, people tend to see color. And we went in there, and when I left the meeting, I told them that the most disheartening thing about the meeting was not the fact that we were meeting about a level 3 sex offender who may be moving in the neighborhood, but that now that my fellow citizens and the people where I've been paying taxes all this time will now feel that other black folks who live in the neighborhood are now public enemy number one because that sex offender happens to be African American. So there's always this kind of group think, is what I call it, where people can't differentiate and can't particularly know. I mean, there's some bad black folks, there's some bad white folks, but there's some good black folks and there's some good. I mean, there's good and bad in everybody, and we can't just judge people by how they look. And I think that one of the things, and I'm going to turn it over to Mahmoud, that I am impressed about is the fact that you're continuing to have these discussions, you're continuing to look at these issues that have become more and more concerning, especially in bad economic times. And we're getting ready to go into that. Now, we've had some good times, and times are going to get rough coming up here. And the rougher it gets, the more reactionary people become. And I had the opportunity, I don't listen to the radio, but I decided I was going to listen to the radio. So I asked my daughter to find something that she thought was suitable for her mom to listen to. So she said, okay, so she was having a very good time, and she found a radio station she thought I would be able to listen to. So I said, okay. And as I was listening to it, first of all, I was cringing through the whole thing because of the fact I kept thinking, I'm letting my 13-year-old listen to this? I can't believe this. But the sexist comments, the racist comments, the sexual innuendos that were made through the whole thing was alarming. And so I was looking at what it is that you all are being fed on a daily basis, and it's very concerning to me in terms of the images that the society is continuing to perpetuate as to what it is that you're bringing in on a daily basis. And even though you're not paying a whole lot of attention to it, it's seeping in and seeping in and seeping in. And I'm not just talking about, this radio station or that radio station, because quite frankly, I can't even tell you what radio station it was because I turned it off probably after 5 minutes. And because I thought I had enough. And then I tried to listen to talk radio, which I do listen to occasionally, just so I can kind of judge what the tenor of on the mood is. And that was also very disturbing also, because we're talking about, and very flippantly, about issues that I think are very near and dear to me, and we're not having good, cogent conversations about what is really real. And I have a lot of issues with that. And I hope, as young people, and it's my hope all the time, and I tell you, I go to bed hoping and praying. I said, these young people have to be smarter than this. They just have to be. Because if they're not smarter, we are really in a heap of trouble. And so I'm putting a whole lot on you. Because I want you to be smarter about these issues. I want you to have discussions about the issues. And I talked to a young man, young white guy, I'll tell you, who worked for me for about 8 weeks or so. And we were talking about issues of how society could really improve itself in terms of homelessness, in terms of joblessness, and the kinds of underclass that we are tending to create. And he had some very good observations and some very good suggestions. And I was so hopeful after I left my conversation with him, because I said, I think the youth of today might really get this. And it's obvious through this discussion that you're having today that we may be in pretty good hands.
He always does that to me. She leaves me with nothing to say. Yes, he always does it. Well, Judge Alexander and I want to say this on a personal note, and I have been around one another off and on for a very long time. I've known her since she was in junior high school or something like that. I don't know. It wasn't grade school.
I was 12.
No, no. Don't say that. Anyway, long time, most of her life, and watched her grow and flower, and it just makes you feel good. You know, every time she walks in a room, it makes me feel good. I may be feeling bad, but I feel better when I see her, because I know it's all right. Somebody got it right. I'm going to just make a few wild stops. First, Mufandizi Joe left not much for me to say because I thought he made a very compelling, gave a very compelling definition of race and what that turns out to be when it becomes ism, a state of condition of being, active. And I want to pick up on that, but first I want to say to you, those of you who've bothered to come and bothered to listen, that you are very important people. I don't believe in the lopsided majority. I may sound elitist. I think it's always the creative minority which moves and shakes the world for good or evil. And one hopes that one or two of you will get it right about this race thing. And that's enough. But it's not enough for you to get it right. I mean, that's not enough. I said that's enough. It's not enough for you to just get it right in your head intellectually. You must try to actualize it. And one of the ways you do that, I'm putting the cart before the horse, is that you engage yourself with people who are different. That's where you start. And you can do that on an individual basis. It doesn't have to be a group, an organization. The preacher doesn't have to tell you to do that. You can do that. That's how you start. As, who is it? Zora Neale Hurston, one of our great writers out of the African American tradition, says, you know, when I look at groups of people and I see them as a group of people, the closer I get to them, the more they become individuals with personalities. And that's what people are. We are fundamentally, inescapably social animal. We can't live outside of a social context. Nobody can. Yes, you have uniqueness, meaning your individuality, not individualism. I think that's fraudulent too. But people are unique as individuals. But you still have to be related to somebody, some human beings, some reference group, or you can't exist as a human being. The human animal is essentially a social animal. That's what that means. You can't live just within yourself. You have to live outside of yourself. And that means other human beings. You follow me? Are you sure? Okay, you know, his daughter's Malcolm X used to say, I was lucky enough to see him 3 times. Even the audience didn't quite get him. He said, do you understand me? And they'd say, yeah. And he said, I know you don't. Because I know you don't. You're not used to hearing this talk. So it takes a while for it to seep in. But let me just say this. I appreciate your coming. I was here on that one day of May. It was so hopeful and time at the same. It was a very terrifying time. Some ugly and marvelous things were going on at the same time. The 1960s, I think, is the most critical decade in 20th century history in America. And there's no period, I'll focus on this decade, in history to equal that in terms of what America was, is, both good and bad. It all happened at the same time. All right, thank you. Pandora's box was open, and people in certain ways have been freer than they've ever been. That includes white, end quote, white people, I'll get to that later, were freer in ways that they had not known by that decade. Not the kind, it's a different kind of freedom because whites and blacks operate on a different power differential. It has nothing to do, as Joe said, with you personally. That's just the way it is. You know, the way the structure of the society is. But white people didn't have the personal liberties that they have now, which is different from what you call equality and that kind of stuff. Judge Marshall will hear you will tell you that. You get more personal freedoms that your parents couldn't imagine. Their parents couldn't imagine. You know, they're middle-aged people now, but they were scared, many of them, of their own shadow. This was a very constipated country in the 1950s and the 60s, socially, politically, otherwise. And that freed up whites rediscovered themselves. Their struggle was not like black people, the right to vote, the right to go to a restaurant or a hotel. That was different. They were givens, like the air for them. But in terms of their own locked-in lives, they were in big trouble. And I think, I know it's the other side, that many white people didn't like themselves very well. And all that showed. It came out. Because the black struggle had opened Pandora's box. That was our role. We let the genie out of the bottle. So everybody could get a little free. As I was trying to break down barriers to get a cup of coffee or go to the University of Minnesota, white people were discovering that I'm something other than white. You know, that I'm 19 years old, I'm 18 years old, and I can fight in a war to defend a country which I can't participate in as a voter. They discovered that. And people discovered that I'm not just white, you know, I have something else going on inside of me in terms of my sexuality. And I've got to stop making myself suffer and do what black people do. Come out of the closet. Oh, you following me? Okay, yeah. See, it's all, I'm saying we're social animals. We all connect. Everything has a place, and yet everything is related to everything else on this earth. And that's an example of what happened, how people were freed in a way that they weren't free before. You know, it's interesting when you get old enough to, and reflective to see how people interpret things, how differently we can interpret things. You know, some people only have the bird's eye view, and some of us have the frog's eye view, too. Some of us can see this. And Richard Wright pointed out that the struggle between black and white people, end quote, in this country is essentially a struggle over the definition of reality. What is real? To me, may not be real to you, and vice versa. But I have to, in some ways, respect your reality. I mean, because of the power differential. And my reality can be dismissed because I don't have power, not real power, which comes through the expression of racism. Now let me move quickly to what I want to pick up on, and I'll come back to that. About race. That's the greatest challenge you've faced. I'm saying Americans. This is affecting, what we do affects the 6 billion people who inhabit this earth in ways that they don't quite, what they do affect us. That's just a fact. At this point in history, America represents what Egypt represented 6,000 years ago. It was a center post of the world as we understand it, as they understood it during Egyptian time. That's true now. I think it's undeniable. Nobody can deny that. That's the only remaining superpower. And we hope this country uses its power for good. Martin Luther King, before him Du Bois, before him Frederick Douglass, before them Mary Church Terrell, Mary McLeod Bethune, all had this in common about black people, that we want to drive America towards its better self. That's our job. It's good. That's the black people's job. It could be a good country. It's already a great country, but it's not good. And good don't mean great. The sinking of the Titanic was a great event. You know, four-alarm fire is great. Bigness, rawness, but it's not good. And we have to say that. And so long as people, humanity can be dismissed by you looking at the shape of my nose, and how much melanin I've got in my skin, it can't be a good country. People are not taught to be good, not taught to respect, to see beyond the superficial. And it all boils down to something, this modern superstition, this thing that was invented in the last 3.5 centuries that we call race, categories of people, pigeonhole people by physicality, physical traits, and extrapolate from that everything else about them. That's really what race teaches you, and that simply is not true. It comes out of the scientific community, and now science is denying that race, there's no biological reality to race. And science has been saying that for 40 years. Now it's seeping out into the popular mind. I'm seeing more articles and more people letting common sense take over and look at what you're calling race. It really doesn't exist biologically, but it does exist as a social construction. It does exist institutionally. You follow me? I know you don't. Okay. Race evolved in the last 300 or 400 years. According to Dr. Ashley Montague, who read the powerful book, Man's Most Dangerous Myth, The Fallacy of Race, tracing the word back to its etymology, to when it entered the English language in 1573, and how people applied the early naturalists, the people who we now call anthropologists and so forth, used a term to classify all the fauna and flora of the earth. It wasn't just about people. It could be a race of flowers, a race of horses, a race of grass blades, so whatever. And when the philosophers came around, the Comte de Gobineaus and the Houston Stewart Chamberlains, the spiritual father of Adolf Hitler and all, they took it out of that construct and applied it only to people. And at first, you applied it to different people in Europe. There were many races in Europe, according to it's a floating signifier. That's what race is. There was a time when, if you were living in the 19th century, a person would say, call you a German and use the terms interchangeably, race with nationality. He's of the German race. It's of the Irish race. You still hear some of that stuff. It's left over. But white, it was white on white when he was talking. White people were talking about white people. The Polish race, you see? And the Polish, yeah. And logic can tell you how it happened when the exploration period, when Chris, remember Chris? You know what I'm talking about? Discovered something? Yeah, well, let me tell you right now. Chris got lost. That's the truth. Let's be truthful about that. Chris got lost. He didn't know quite where he was going. After he got where he was going, didn't know where he was. After he got back, he didn't know where he'd been, and he did it with somebody's money. So he was a real hustler. But Chris, the exploration, where Europeans, like no other people, saw all these different populations of people, different colors and so forth. And this is when they're categorizing and pigeonholing and so forth. And one guy came up with 17 different races in Africa before it crystallized into skin color alone. 17 different races in Africa. In Europe, you had the Nordic race, the Alpine race, the Mediterranean race. Yeah. This evolved. Man went to study the people in the Caucasus. Johannes Blumenbach, who's the father of anthropology, studied these tow-headed, blue-eyed, fair-skinned people and called them Caucasians. And as time would have it, it became generally applied to people with light skin, not just with blonde hair, blue eyes, and pale skin. And that's the so-called white man, which is a modern construction. I defy you to find Europeans call themselves white before that period. They're more likely to find their solidarity around Christianity because the world had been divided, the Christians and the heathens. You Christian? Yeah, well, that's the definition. When they dealt with Indians, they called the Native Americans heathens versus what? Christians. not white. As closer we get to modern times, the more stuff like white. And of course, I need not tell any black person with any common sense that no Negroes came out of Africa. I hope you know that. Igbos came out of Africa, Hausas, Yorubas, Ashantes, Mandinkas, all of these proud people who had histories ancient, more ancient than Europe, than what we call Europe today. So there are no Negroes, that's a category. You know, Indians in America, that's a category, a racial category. Oh, okay, I'm getting a signal. I thought I was going to give a lecture, but that's all right. Yes, you know, racial categories, you know, when you meet your Native American friends, they don't tell you they're Indian, they tell you what? The name of their what? Nation. Which is what? Is it Chippewa?
No.
Is it? What is it?
Anishinaabe.
Anishinaabe. Where I came from in the Deep South, the people around me were Seminoles, Cherokees, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creeks in the southeastern part of the country. And that's what they call themselves. Because that connotes what? Language, land, and so forth. That's who human beings are. If you want the real identity of human beings, all human beings, is language. When you back into the who-ness of you, it's language, land, custom, mores, habit, what we please call culture and ethnicity today. So, well, I have to cut off what I was trying to say about racism. Let me give just 2 more minutes to say this. Race, if you don't have race, without race you have the construction, the false, the superstition I call it. The superstition is comparable to having possessions or believing in ghosts and so forth. Because the word exists, you think the reality exists. Not so. So racism involved an act of discrimination. It's not prejudice, which is an attitude. I'm prejudiced about a lot of things, meaning I don't know the facts. You know, you act without knowing the facts. But racism has nothing to do with the facts. You could know the facts. Because it's also ideological. It's an indoctrination. It's the way you interpret and look at life. And all of this has been formed in the last 300 or 400 years. The Constitution originally was a racist document, 1787. That's why the great William Lloyd Garrison, the white abolitionist, says what? The Constitution has a covenant with hell. It has a date with death. It's not worth the paper it's written on. Tear it up. Burn it up, because it's a slaveholding document. And it was until it was changed. Yeah. Well, no, that's before the 14th Amendment.
I know, so I want to keep that part.
Yeah, but no. Well, one of your mentors said, the late Thurgood Marshall, he said, you know, after the Bill of Rights, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, the 19th Amendment dealing with women, you can tear it up. It ain't worth the paper it's written on. That is the essence of the Constitution. That's right. To protect your individual's right, the Bill of Rights, you know, the right to speak. You know, I wouldn't be talking here if it weren't for the Bill of Rights, right? And the amendments which legally freed black people, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote in 1920. He says that's what it is. But you look at it as a commercial document. Mostly it's about people, you know, doing their business. It's about slaves. It's about commerce. That's what it's about. And so the original abolitionists was called the Constitution. They were talking about secession before the South. So no union with slavery. That was the slogan in the North. No union with slavery, because it's a slave document. It's a commercial document. And it was. Now, this is what I really don't like about Americans. And I can say that because I'm an American. You know, it's like family, okay? I hope I can say that. Been here long enough to say that. I don't like the idea of people playing stupid on me. You know, like intellectuals and lawyers and people like that. I don't like that. When I know that you know, and you're pretending that you don't know, intellectual, that's got to stop. One last, and I won't say the rest of it. A man I know who's a lawyer, who was a diplomat, who was a dean of the law school at Harvard, everything. You know, he was raised in an international, knows everything. And we got to talking some way. He likes to talk to me. I don't know why. But he said, we got around to talking about Thomas Jefferson. And I told him what I thought was of Thomas Jefferson. I thought he was a great man with some obvious flaws. Everybody has some flaws. It just so happened his flaws were devastating to our people. And so he could not be a hero to me. You know, even though he's a hero to you, and that's okay. You know, these are two realities that Richard Wright was talking about. It's okay. You know, but he can't be a hero to me. You know, I laid off, you know, what I thought was wrong with him when he talked about black people being, I advanced it as a suspicion only that whether originally distinct or made distinct by time and circumstances, that the blacks are not equal to the whites, both in the endowments of the mind and body. They're not. They're inferior. And then he turns around and appoints Benjamin Banneker to help build the city of Washington, who was black. I know you've heard of Benjamin Banneker. Okay. You know, he was one of the 3 men on that commission to help build the city. He exploited black people's genius, but at the same time, that's racism. He's one of the authors of white supremacy. And I think he's also a pedophile. Yeah, he said, well, he said, well, I never heard of that. Well, I said, damn it. Read Notes on Virginia. You get most of it. He wrote that book. I did, didn't you? And he said he never read the book. And I said, I don't believe you. Not as well read. You speak 3 languages. I only speak 2, broken English and profanity. And you know this stuff. So don't stop. We got an argument.